is absolutely critical. I talk to people all the time who said, I joined the church because you called me after I visited the church. Now, to me, that doesn't seem very important. I don't really care what the pastor calls me after I visit a church or not. But I grew up in the church and I think differently. But for many, many people, they told me, we visited a number of churches. This is the only church that contacted us after we visited. My parents, when they moved to Texas, visited a whole bunch of churches. They said, nobody calls the visitors in Texas. I said, Dad, nobody called the visitors in Michigan either. That's just, and honestly, we're dropping the ball. If we give a hoot about evangelism, you've got to be calling these people and talking to them. Even if you don't care if they ever join your church, do you care about them as human beings? I mean, this is what our gospel is. So this call has to be made 24 to 48 hours afterwards. Best if it's the same day, which means you've got to be hopping on Sunday. And of course, nobody wants to be hopping on Sunday, right? You know, and the church ends, you're starving, it's almost kickoff. If you're a counter, bad news. You're going to go sit in the back room and count money for a little while. But guess what? If you're on the evangelism team, bad news. You're going to go sit and you're going to parse names. Because if you're in a church that's lucky enough to have 15 to 20 first-time visitors on a Sunday morning, you got a lot of names to go through. And who's going to call those folks? And let me tell you what, I was at the largest church in North Carolina for 3 years, and the senior pastor called every single first-time visitor. And that impressed people. The senior pastor of a congregation could do that. He could have passed it to the other 3 pastors, and he chose not to. He said, I'm going to do this myself. Now, I'm not saying the pastor has to make these calls. In fact, studies show that it's more effective if lay people make the calls. But I think it's very important for the pastor to do some of these calls so that you know what the game looks like, so that you can help train the lay people to make these calls. And I'll talk about what these calls look like in a minute. I mean, I went to a non-denominational evangelism thing one time, and they said, the top 3 rules of evangelism are this. Protect them from the church, protect them from the church, protect them from the church. I mean, maybe you've all been in this circumstance where you haven't invited someone to church because you were afraid about how they would be treated. So we have to help our communities become more welcoming, open communities. Otherwise, people are not going to invite people ultimately. Okay, here's how this call goes. I made most of these calls in my last parish, and this is how it would go. I either created a 3x5 card, or later on I used the tear-off as my system. I never went digital with this. I was never able to make it work digitally for me. I probably would be doing it digitally if I was doing it today. But I would take the tear-off that they had turned in. And if I got names from the counters, it was usually a photocopy of the check that they would just give me the photocopy of the check. So I would have photocopies of checks. I would have these slips of paper, and then the secretary, Sharon Cheney, would go through the guest book, and she would make a list for me, and I did this on Mondays. And I would take these names down, and I would have them all together, and I would just call these folks up. And usually I got a voice message. I would say at least half the time I got a voice message. So this doesn't take as much time as you think. And most of them will not call you back, but some of them will. And I would say, hi, my name is Mike. Thank you for visiting Grace Lutheran Church. I always say it, I'm trying to burn the name of the church in on the brain. Thank you for visiting, or maybe they don't remember what church they visited, because remember, the name's not as clear to them as it is to you. Thank you for visiting Grace Lutheran Church yesterday. I don't actually start with this one, but I always have it in my back pocket. How was it for you? But my next question was, what brought you to church? And then I just shut up, which is hard for me to do. I just shut up and listen. Listen, 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 listen. Because here's the deal. Most people who visit a church have gone through something. Maybe they've just moved. That moving is traumatic. It's like one of the top stressors on all the list of stressors. They don't know. They might ask where the post office is. You can be a resource for them. And people will cling to the first person that shows any care and concern for them in their situation. So the first thing is, what brought you here? And here, we just moved to the area. Oh, really? Where'd you move from? How'd it go? Sometimes it might be a year, and they'll be embarrassed because they're looking for a church a year after they moved into the area, and they're talking to the pastor. But you know what? People nest in their home first, and they nest in the community second. It usually takes them a while to get around to finding a church, or maybe they've been visiting for some time. But we listen to that. Or maybe they're divorced. And a lot of times people get divorced, they no longer feel comfortable worshiping in their old church. We're going to worship across the pew, across the sanctuary from their spouse. And it's just kind of weird. Oftentimes both people leave the church after a divorce. And in some churches, they're made to feel unwelcome because divorce is considered a sin. Or maybe they can't take communion because they're Catholic. And they're looking for the sacrament. This is an important thing to them. This happens a lot in New Orleans, where the majority of the community is Roman Catholic. So, what brought you is a really, really big question. Or maybe they've just come to a place in their life where all of a sudden they're searching for a spiritual community of some sort. And they've had the audacity to think they might find it in a mainline congregation. We better be ready to have that spiritual conversation with them. So these people, if you don't call them as pastor, if you're a lay person, or if you're training lay people to do it, you've got to get people that are sensitive. This is not a recruitment call. This is a pastoral care call. This is a care call. How are you doing? What's it like? What's it like living in Texas after living in New England for the last 10 years? Or what's it like moving from California? A bit of a culture shift for you? And it's a caring conversation. And then I usually get around to how is it, because I'm a pastor and I want to know. And here's the deal. You're going to learn volumes here. You're going to learn everything you need to know from this question right here about what's messed up about your church. If you establish trust with them, they will tell you, your nursery stinks. Your nursery stinks. I couldn't find the sanctuary. The parking lot was a mess. Nobody said hello to me. I mean, they will tell you, if you create an atmosphere of trust, they will let you know what it is that you need to know in this conversation, and you need to hear that stuff. And then, if they fill out a prayer request, I mentioned that immediately. So we're praying for your mom. What's going on there? Or if they don't fill out a prayer request, I'll sometimes ask them, is there something for which that I can be praying for you? And then the last part of the conversation is an invitation to come back. This has to be absolutely there. And if it's a lay person, this is even better because, as a pastor, when I invite people to come back, I can't greet them, I can't take them to coffee, I'm busy on Sunday morning, honestly. But if I'm a lay person, I can say, hey, I'll meet you before the service. Would you like to sit with me? And sitting alone in church is a weird thing sometimes. And sometimes just having someone say, come on over. Or if I feel it's appropriate, inviting them for coffee or something like that. Be careful with that. You've got to know who you are, whether you can do that or not. But this is an important part of the conversation. And some of them will say, yeah, I'm coming back, or no, we're Baptists, we're really kind of looking for something a little bit less formal. I've heard that numerous times from folks who visit if you're Baptist and you're used to, songs and sermon, and all of a sudden you walk into Kyrie, Gloria, Agnus Dei, Sanctus, it's an adjustment for some of them, and some of them don't like it necessarily, which is why I think it's really good if you've got two services that you start allowing one to just kind of loosen up a little bit, because some people will really appreciate the church stuff, but other people need something a little bit more laid back. Comments, questions about this follow-up call? I would say you need to have a new member class going at least once a quarter. If somebody comes to you and says, I'd like to join this church, and you say, yeah, oh great, we have a new member class coming up in 8 months. Right? I mean, that's a problem. It just doesn't really work ultimately. So it's very, very important that you have an opportunity sooner than that for them to join. But I don't think that needs to be the first conversation, and it's not a conversation you have on your follow-up call for a visitor. But what it is nice to have is at least one event that's coming up to which you could invite people. So if you have a congregational dinner coming up, or a play, or hey, Christmas Eve services are 7, 9, and 11 on Christmas Eve, come and join us. Having some kind of a event to invite them to, or a Bible study, which will scare unchurched people. So you might say small group. And by the way, I wouldn't call this a new member class. I would find something else, call it an inquirer's class. What the non-denominational churches do, they call it Meet the Pastor. They'll have it every Sunday in large churches where you're going to have a lot of visitors. In a mega church that has over 2,000 people on a Sunday morning, you're going to have a bunch of visitors. And they will have something during the lunch hour afterwards with some light finger foods. It's just come and meet the pastor. And it's the first step. They don't really do membership the way we do membership, but it's a way for them to start to feel like they know the senior pastor a little bit. And for those that do new member classes, it's then something that's like, for example, in the Saddleback model, you'd be invited to a 101 class. Or some of you have used Alpha as a way to do new member class. The new member class has to be geared for people who don't know the Bible. Do not assume that people know the story of the Good Samaritan. Do not assume that people know the story of the prodigal son. We oftentimes treat our new member classes like these are all Lutherans that have come down from the north. And what we need to do is recognize that you're going to have some unchurched people who will walk in the door. And so there has to be some kind of easy entry point where people feel safe and comfortable to ask hard questions and say, I don't know about this, I don't understand that, I don't believe this. And that needs to happen fairly regularly. So think about what you call that. Inquirers is just probably the most popular. Don't get me wrong about what I'm going to say here, because I think our Lutheran heritage is important, but I downplay Lutheran almost at every opportunity I get, because it's another weird word that freaks people out. They don't know exactly what you're talking about. And let me tell you, being Lutheran is not the most interesting thing about this. I'm not saying it's an uninteresting thing. I love our Lutheran theology, and it undergirds everything we do. But when I'm talking with somebody on an airplane, I don't lead with Lutheran, I'm a follower of Christ first and foremost. And yeah, I'm Christian in the Lutheran key, but it's like telling somebody you're Moravian. That's what it sounds like to people. Yeah, I'm a Moravian. What does that mean? It's like, honestly, that's not where I want to start the conversation. I want to start the conversation with something that's absolutely life-giving about who I am and not about who I am, but who I am in light of what the gospel is in my life and in my church life and so forth. And sometimes just talking about what your church is doing is the easiest way to enter into that conversation.